Hey, this is Brennon.
And this is Heather.
And you're listening to Shaped by Grace.
God calls us to live a holy life. But what exactly does this mean, and what does it look like on a daily basis?
So our hope is to explore how we are being shaped by grace through the good news of Jesus. So let's get into it.
Hey everybody, so I'm back. Last week was kind of crazy. The last couple of weeks were really crazy. I'm still pregnant, still have a baby cooking in my belly. So we didn't do one episode 1 week because I thought I was going into labor, but I ended up not. And so we were just kind of more focused on trying to rest because of the winter storm last week. And we didn't really want to bring a newborn home during all that. So I have been just trying to rest as much as possible to make sure that baby girl didn't come too early or during the middle of a winter storm. But all is well now. Now is okay for her to come. We are prepared now. So that's kind of what's been happening the last couple of weeks, why we didn't have one episode 1 week, and then why Brennan did an episode last week by himself. But we are back and hopefully going to get a little bit back on track with what we've been talking about. So for relationships, we're still continuing our series on relationships. So we talked about singleness. With Jeremy, we talked about dating. And then Brennan talked about our relationship with God. And today we are going to talk about marriage.
Yeah.
It's what brings us together today.
That's
the Princess Bride.
It's going to be interesting. At least I think so. And so what we want to do today is what we don't want to do today is define the roles of marriage, what the role of a husband is, what the role of a wife is. I think that could be maybe a different podcast. But today we want to focus in on how marriage is a reflection of God, how our relationship between husband and wife ties in with our relationship with God and ties in to our calling as Christians. And I think the first place that we wanted to start really is to define marriage. And as most beginnings, or most definitions begin, you have to start at the beginning in Genesis to define what marriage is. And so we see that in Genesis, we are created in the image of God, and everything that ties in with anything that we do is there to reflect the image of God. And so in marriage, the first thing about marriage is it's a reflection of God, who we are as humans. We are made in God's image. And so when we're brought together as husband and wife, male and female, we are glorifying God through that act. And we are revealing who He is to people around us.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that will try to take, we were actually talking about this on our way home from getting dinner, about how they try to take scripture and say, well, this word isn't in the New Testament, like this isn't really what it means, but you always have to go back to creation and see, what did God intend when He created man and woman? What did He intend with marriage? He says that it's not good for man to be alone. That is why He created Eve. And then we see Him saying that a man would leave his family to be with his wife. And that's marriage. It is between a man and a woman. And so that is very, very clear. People try to take the Bible and they try to be like, oh, translation this, translation that, or they try to say, well, it's all about the culture. But it's very clear from the very beginning. Anytime that the image of God is attacked, meaning us, whether it's about our gender, our sexuality, whatever it is, all Genesis is always the first place to start in talking with people when they begin to question what God intended when it came to marriage, to the institution of marriage, to gender, all of those things. That's the best place to start. And really, you don't have to go to other places if you don't want to, because that's a really good argument just from right there what God intended.
And that union between man and husband, man and husband, JK, man and wife isn't meant to be broken, and we see Jesus acknowledging that in Matthew 19, that we're made in one flesh, and that union isn't meant to be broken. A divorce isn't meant to be a part of marriage. You're meant to stay together, to work things out, and then in Ephesians 5, it gives us more examples of what marriage actually looks like, what it means to live out being a husband and being a wife. The husband is to love his wife just as Christ loves the church and gave himself up for her. And so husbands are to be committed. And the same thing to wife. Wives should submit. They should be committed to this relationship so that both of us, the husband and the wife, can be image bearers of God and reflect God by doing their part. And so with that being said, what we want to focus in on is, so how does marriage reflect God? What scriptures do we see where God uses the language of marriage to show us and to create the story of Jesus coming? Or how does marriage show up in the Bible?
Well, we see obviously Adam and Eve, which we've mentioned. And then, Jesus talking about how we become one flesh. We see Paul talk about it in several books in the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, we see, obviously leaders getting, like certain prophets or certain people getting married. And, the whole book of Hosea is about his marriage being a reflection of God and Israel. Yeah. And I think that's the kind of the theme of the Old Testament is God is constantly pursuing Israel because he's made a covenant with them. Yeah. But Israel continues he says adultery. You can, he even says, you whore yourselves to other countries.
Very strong language.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that we start off with that language of it's a covenant, because even today, whenever a man and a woman get married, it's a covenant. That means that two parties come together. They make an agreement to do a certain thing, and both parties have their weight to hold. Yeah. And with Israel and God said that you will be my people, that you will be a holy nation. And so
you're set apart.
Yeah, your part in that marriage, that covenant, is to be holy. And God will fulfill his promise in making you a nation like no other nation. And God will be reflected in that covenant relationship. And that is the story of the Old Testament. If you look at the prophets are begging Israel to do their part. Mm-hmm. Because if they don't, they're gonna be punished. They're going to go into exile. But like you said, God continuously rescues Israel. He always does his part. He's always faithful. He's always there to, Israel may suffer, but to bring them out of there. And there's a lot of marriage language in that. Like you said earlier, that they were in an adulterous relationship with the things of the world, with the idols of the world, with other nations. He was like, you have an adulterous relationship with them. I told you to be part of my plan, and you made that promise to it. And so it's a reflection of marriage, that marriage is between two parties, and that both parties have a role to play in that.
And I think it's also important to point out how every time Israel seeks other gods, seek other countries, seek something outside of God and outside of their covenant, it never ends well for Israel. They're constantly at war, or they get sent into exile. They get enslaved and all of these other things. And, like I mentioned with the book of Hosea, his wife Gomer, like she gets used, and Israel constantly gets used by all of these other countries, all of these other cultures, but God still seeks them out. And, and I think that shows that marriage, when you're in a marriage, it's really easy to, and you have to be mindful and on guard about having outside influences in your marriage. Being mindful of that, being mindful of temptations. And I'm not just talking about adultery. Like there's other things that can hurt your marriage.
I mean, work can hurt your marriage. And those things.
Even your kids, like prioritizing your kids before your marriage, work, just things that the culture says about women and men, and their roles, feminism, transgenderism.
Yeah, Israel, it wasn't always that they chose other gods. Like sometimes it was, all right, we're going to make our military powerful, and we're going to take control of that by buying chariots from Egypt. And that got them in trouble because they weren't trusting in God. And so in a marriage relationship, you really have to be careful with what becomes your priority, what you put before your marriage, what you put before that will show where your trust lies.
Yeah.
And so part of a marriage is to reflect God. As image bearers of Him, our job is to reflect Him. So what we prioritize is a reflection of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to spend some time talking about the attributes in marriage that we practice that reflect God. Because we're kind of like a mini microcosm of the church.
Mm-hmm.
The family is in that aspects. And in marriage, we are to reflect some attributes that God reflects with Israel. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about our first one on our list is grace. And so we know how God shows grace. He gave us His one and only Son that died on the cross, and through His death, burial, and resurrection, we receive forgiveness of our sins, and we constantly mess up. And God shows us grace in that area. So how do we practice grace in marriage?
I think it's something that's daily, just like understanding the grace of God on a daily basis and knowing that we've been given grace through Christ. It's something that you have to do on a daily basis. Obviously, Brennan and I are both humans, and we've only been married a little over 4 years, so there's still so much that we have to learn.
We get on each other's nerves, and sometimes...
Yeah, we just spend the whole week, basically, with each other.
Or the way that we speak with each other. But I like what you said at the beginning is, for me to show you grace, I have to understand the grace of God.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's missing out on people that get married who aren't Christians. Like, they don't understand. Like, they're like, oh, marriage is cool. We get to file our taxes together and have kids and get money back. But they're missing out on the point that marriage is a reflection of God. And so...
Or it's just like a lot of people just think it's, oh, well, this is just the next step.
Yeah.
Like, we've been dating
for
a very
12
long
years.
time. Yeah, I know. You have lots of opinions about that. We've been dating. This is just the natural next step that we need to take. Or they focus so much on the idea of marriage and the wedding, but then you get into marriage and you realize, okay, this is really hard.
Yeah, and it is. And I think that every time that I find I'm not showing Heather grace is because I'm not reminding myself of the grace that I've been given. And that is the source of a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of not really fights, but a lot of strife,
Yeah.
a lot of heartache is I'm not understanding the grace of God, and that my job is to be a reflection of that to Heather and to the people around me, but specifically to you. And so, in showing grace, if you mess up, not being harsh, like, or not being snappy, or not being short, and those things, it takes practice. Like, they're not easy, and I don't think they're supposed to be. Like, I guarantee the relationship between God and Israel was not easy.
Yeah. And I think something else too to point out is there are times, I think, I don't remember who said it. I think it was our pastor at our old church. Might have talked about this, or someone else, but talking about how when we get frustrated, it's because we think we know better.
Yeah.
And so there are times when we get frustrated with the way things are going. And it's because we think we should have control, and that what God is doing is not part of what we think is best. And so I think that's where grace comes in too. But also that happens so much in marriage. Like, and I struggle with that, and I can admit that.
You mean control?
Well, not necessarily like control, but when I do get frustrated, like, I'm not a control freak or anything, but just I'm not extending grace to Brennon because I think something should be done a certain way, and he doesn't do it that way. And
like
so
dishes?
I get frustrated.
Like putting the dishes in the dishwasher the correct way? No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I think that's spot on, because control is an issue. I sent a text to the college guys today, and I talked about, like, God wants to change the way we think, and for us to not be self-centered, we have to become God's holy and chosen people. Like, we have to accept Jesus. Any other way, we will always be self-centered, and even as Christians, we still are self-centered, but we're reminded that we don't have to be that way. Like, God doesn't call us to be self-centered.
Yeah. And I think that kind of segues into the next attribute of talking about forgiveness.
Yeah.
So how in marriage is forgiveness, how do we see forgiveness in marriage, and then how is that reflecting upon the forgiveness of God?
I think that the first point in each of these is to see how God lays the foundation for how we should act in these attributes. And first off, so he's forgiven us completely, and he keeps no record of wrong. And that's where I want to start out is, all right, when I forgive Heather for doing something, I don't keep a record of it. This is the 745th time that I've asked you to do this. And no, like, that's so dumb. Like, that just leads, that's not true forgiveness. If we mess up, we forgive, and we don't keep a record of it. Like, that's forgiveness. And I hear the phrase, I forgive, but I don't forget. And that just makes you bitter. And that just hardens your heart towards one another of, like, she did this again. Like, I've forgiven her, but man, like, that's not building the relationship. That's not, I want to use a big word, but I don't want to use that word. It's not like getting rid of that sin and building that relationship back up. Like, all it's doing is keeping you two far, and you'll never build that trust back type thing.
Yeah. And I think that some of that comes from like you said, the I forgive, but I don't forget. There's this whole thing where it's like, oh, I cut people out that are not beneficial to me, that don't care about me.
And it's all self-centered.
Yeah. And I think that idea is why there's a lot of divorces, because when Christ is not the focus of your marriage, when he's not the priority, when ultimately you're not submitting to his authority, you are very self-centered, and there is a lot of control issues. There's a lot of, like Brennon said, keeping track of sin, and or wrongdoings in your marriage, and so you lose sight of that, and you it's more about how are you meeting my needs? How are you loving me? And it's more about feelings and stuff. And so, when you ask people why they get divorced, they're like, oh, well, we fell out of love, which doesn't make any sense to me.
You choose to love.
Yeah. Or like, oh, it's just not the same. Like they're not the same person. They're not meeting my needs. But then you want to ask them like, well, are you meeting their needs as well? Like, it's a lot of selfishness.
And I think you're hitting on a pretty practical point of communication, which I think could be used for another podcast. But just like God communicated with Israel, like he told them, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. Hey, I'm calling you back to our original covenant promise.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have to have that in mind and communicate not only between each other, but being in the Word and communicating what it means for marriage. And I think the last attribute that I want to talk about is love, because you hit on this idea that people fall out of love, and that's not biblical. That's not. God doesn't fall out of love with his people. He gets frustrated with Israel. He calls Israel to repentance, but he doesn't say, all right, guys, I'm not going to use you. Like, because something you did, like, I don't love you type thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'll start off, but love is a choice. Like, I choose to love people or hate people. It's not this feeling or this infatuation with Heather. While I do feel, and I do have a feeling for her, like I'm attracted to her. I love our relationship, but I choose to love you. And when I'm not choosing to love you, that's not being reflective of God.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't just wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm not going to love these people because of what they do for me. Like, I choose to love you no matter what, even if you're cranky or hormonal or anything below or above the standard that I've set for you, or the standard that I feel God has set for you. Like, I still love you. I love you in your worst days or in your best days. I'm really confused with what my dog's doing right now. He jumped in my lap and he's tripping out. But anyway, I think that's really important, because in your vows, a lot of people say that, like, I'll love you in good and in bad, in sickness and in health. Like,
but do they mean it?
Yeah, that's a choice. And if you're getting divorced, you chose not to love that person because of something they did or something like that.
Yeah. And I would agree, like, love is a choice. It is something that you choose. And when you make a vow, like, you're making a covenant with that person and you're promising them, like, I'm choosing you. I am choosing to stand by your side no matter what. And I don't think people understand the weight of what they're saying. And I think that's why words matter. Like, you can't just say something with a vow and be like, okay, it's done. Like, I think
matter.
I think in today's culture, it's like we just say things. We make empty promises. And so the weight of covenant is not understood today. And so I think you have to kind of be mindful of that. And I think understanding the covenant that God has made with us through Christ helps us to understand the covenant between a man and a woman and what love is. And everybody always uses the verses from Corinthians where it's like, love is patient, love is kind. And
it is.
and those are, but people just use it and it's just like a nice, sweet little thing.
Yeah.
But
are you going to be patient with me when I'm at my worst?
Yeah. And I think about the things that Brennon and I have been through in our marriage. Even though we've only been married a little over 4 years, we've been through a whole lot in just a short amount of time. I mean, our whole first year of marriage, like, I was really sick. We bought a house. I tried to work. It didn't work out because of my health issues. We were not sure what was going on with me. And I think that helped us to understand, like, okay, this is it. We're in it for the long run.
Yeah.
And then we moved to Shreveport, and that's been a whole adventure for us. And, now we're parents. And so there's just a lot of things that have happened that have tested us and made us realize, like, okay, like, this is it. We've made a covenant with each other. And I know that there are going to be other trials that come up in our marriage. And we're going to have to choose to love one another. And there are going to be times when I probably am not going to want to love Brennan. I'm going to want to be as far away from him as possible, or vice versa. But choosing to stay, choosing to be a reflection of Christ, I think that's super important.
Yeah. So let's just kind of, sum up what we've talked about today. So we've defined marriage as between a man and a woman, that it's a covenant and that it's everlasting. And then our job as Christians is to reflect God in our marriage. So our marriage should be a reflection of his attributes. And the way that we do that is we show those attributes to one another. And people will see how our marriage is a reflection of God by the way that we act, the way that we show each other grace, show each other forgiveness, show each other love. And in doing that, people will see the goodness of God. God called Israel to do certain things, to live a holy life. And he said that he would get all the glory from that. And so as Christians, our job in marriage is to give God the glory, to be a reflection of him.
Mm-hmm.
And so we appreciate everyone that is listening and that has listened to our podcast. It's been fun. And we want to continue to do this to help you in your walk and living a holy life like we're called to. And so if you guys have any thoughts or conversations that you want us to have, we would love to hear from you. You can follow us on Instagram at shape.bygrace on Instagram, and you can find both of our profiles through that.
Yeah.
We want to be a part of your life and walk with you wherever you are.
Yeah.
And so we want to encourage you to reach out.
Yeah. And obviously with this specific podcast with marriage, there was a lot of things that we didn't necessarily hit on. And we kind of did that on purpose, just because, there are literal series on marriage, and so if this is something you want us to continue further on, like if you want us to talk about the specific roles of a man and a woman in a marriage, maybe talk about divorce or issues that come up in marriage, like common issues, like that's something we can discuss a little bit further. But I just wanted to point that out too. But we want to hear from y'all. So please let us know if there's any topics that maybe you want us to hit on, or maybe something we've already talked about that you want us to dig a little bit deeper in. But I think that's all we've got today.
Yep. All right, guys. Thank y'all, and we love you.
All right.
Peace out, Boy Scout.